Today's episode is going to be about 3D printing health and safety and about what might be lingering in the air of your 3D printing room. I got my brand spanking new Bambu Lab A1 Mini over here. I know a lot of my viewers have their printer set up in a bedroom. Now if you bothered to read the included safety guidelines that come with a printer like this, it says do not operate the printer barefoot. But the 13th and final point on this instruction sheet, right in the fine print here, it says to operate your printer in a well-ventilated environment. So this will be a good experiment to show you what your lungs get exposed to if you're just running this printer in an enclosed environment. Now I've turned my HEPA filter off for this test, and after it's finished, I'm going to repeat the test with the HEPA filter on to see if that makes any difference. Take a look at the particle meter. You can see it spiked a little bit earlier at what I'd consider to be unhealthy levels. We'll give this another try with the HEPA filter running and see if that addresses anything. Another interesting thing to note, the VOCs went up and they just kind of leveled off. So while the particles settled out of the air after the print finished, the VOCs stayed lingering in the room. And I'm wondering, how effective is this filter at clearing up those particles and also those VOCs? So let's see how it works. So it looks like if you have a HEPA filter running and you're filtering the air that's coming off of your 3D printer, then you really don't have to worry too much about particulate counts. They'll be kept relatively low. Really, you just have to be worried if you're in a situation where you're running the printer in an enclosed space with no filtration or ventilation. Then your particulate counts will go up, and if you're printing materials that release a lot of VOCs, those will go up as well. If we look at the TVOC reading here, you did see a buildup in the first print, and that buildup continued throughout this print. So what that means is the HEPA filter wasn't really doing anything about these VOCs. When the HVAC system of the building turned on and it recirculated fresh air into this room, then we see that VOC reading going back down. The highest that we saw these readings get was 0.28 milligrams per cubic meter, which is still, that's kind of at the upper end of what you'd consider healthy indoor air, but it's not overly concerning. What's more concerning to me is the microparticles. So if we look at the particles per liter readings, especially while the prints were running with no ventilation, those appeared to ramp up and just stay at a sustained high level while I was running prints for long periods of time. So there are particles in the air that are being generated by running a 3D printer, even if you're printing materials that you generally consider to be safe, like PLA and PETG. And this just has to do with the fact that you're heating up that plastic to beyond its melting point. Even water will release particles into the air. The only difference is when water evaporates and recondenses into little mist droplets, those can be safely inhaled, and it's just water, so it gets absorbed into your lungs. With plastics, it's a little bit different because it's creating little soot particles out of the plastic. It's evaporating off little bits of polymer that can be recondensed into a solid piece of material. Then you have like little plastic particles floating around in the room, which begs the question, what's in those plastic particles? And do they contain any harmful chemicals? This filament and this printer is putting out more particulate matter than I would feel comfortable with in an enclosed space. Once the printer stopped running, the particulate matter kind of just tapered off over time on its own. And I think that's just a natural consequence of gravity. Particulates tend to precipitate out of the air. They'll just fall and land on a surface and build up as dust. So if you go to the EPA's website, I'll leave a link to this in the description below. These particles are deposited in your nose, your mouth, your trachea, your bronchi, and your alveoli. I drew a little diagram here to help you guys out. So larger particles here tend to collect in your mouth and in your nose. If things are deposited in your mouth or in your nose, when you go into your lungs, it's just one airway that branches out into a bunch of smaller airways, and those are called bronchi. And they're all lined with these cilial cells that'll basically trap stuff, and slowly it'll work its way back out of your mouth and you'll either swallow it or spit it out. You don't want to get stuff into your lungs because your body has to do a lot of work to get that stuff out. You'll be coughing up phlegm and that kind of stuff, and it's just kind of gross and unhealthy. But what's more worrying is the smaller particles that can make their way deep into your lungs can get into your alveolar region And that's like the individual sacs at the very end of your lungs where the actual oxygen transfer will happen. Once you get into those areas, there aren't as many mechanisms to get the particles back out. So really small particles are a little more dangerous because they'll make their way deeper into your lungs and they'll stay there permanently. These particles in some cases can cause scarring of your lung tissue, which can decrease how effective your lungs are and lead to health conditions. If you don't have a safe place to run your 3D printers, don't worry. Today's sponsor, JLC 3DP, has you covered. You can get your parts printed with ABS, PLA, all sorts of materials. You can just have them print it and ship it to you. You just upload your files to their website. You get a nice little preview of what the file looks like. It'll let you pick out your materials. You can even do metals. You can do resin 3D printing. Like me personally, I don't really want to have a resin 3D printer in my house or workspace. So if I wanted resin parts, I could just have them make it, and they're very affordable to have them done through JLC 3DP. JLC 3DP also has metal 3D printing services, and there's a bunch of other products and services that they offer, including PCB manufacturing and CNC manufacturing through their affiliated companies. I use them for a lot of my projects, including the giant 3D printer that I've been working on. So if you want to check them out and support the channel, make sure to use the link in the video description below to let them know that you saw this video and you wanted to try them out. I've also got another upcoming project from JLC. This is how I get all of my custom machine parts produced, because they offer affordable pricing, and this stuff, I send it to them, they get it manufactured and shipped to me within about a week. And I paid for these. They are sponsoring the video, but they need to hook me up with some more coupons because I have a lot of stuff made. So maybe I can talk to my agent about that. All right, let's get back to the video. Ironically, when you have particles and they keep getting smaller and smaller, they can make their way deeper into your lungs. But there's also another end to the curve. You can see it here on the graph, where it's very steep up here. This deposition fraction is saying what percentage of the particles are getting trapped in what area of your respiratory tract. Here you can see the very smallest nano-sized particles mostly get captured by your mouth and your nose. So there's something that happens called Brownian motion. So these particles are just bouncing around off the walls at very small sizes. So they're bouncing around in there, and it's really easy for them to move around and get stuck somewhere. They'll just run into the wall of your sinuses or your mouth and get captured there. The larger the particle is, the less Brownian motion there is, so the more stable they are. And you see this dip where your head and your mouth and nose aren't capturing the particles anymore, and they're getting breathed deeper into the lungs. So a lot of these smaller particles end up going into your bronchi and into your alveolar region. So these are the ones that you want to be more worried about. And that's not to say that you shouldn't be worried about these small nano-sized particles, because those can also contain toxic chemicals that can get absorbed into your body. The good news is that larger particles like glass and carbon fibers, the whole pieces, won't make it deep into your lungs because they'll get captured somewhere in your mouth and in your nose typically. Now if you're sanding or machining or otherwise breaking down those little fibers, they can be broken into smaller pieces that can make their way deeper into your lungs. Also, when it comes to these nanoparticle soots, they can build up and form agglomerates. So let's say you have 1 million little nanoparticles stuck together in a ball. That can form into basically one entity, and then that will be treated like a larger molecule with regards to your respiratory tract. So you could have a big cluster of little nanoparticles that gets inhaled, and it makes its way deeper into your respiratory system because it's not affected as much by Brownian motion. Now, this is all a little complicated. Just suffice to say that there's a lot of particles in the air, and the basic things you need to know is that there's a size range that makes it deep into your lungs and can be deposited there. And those are the ones that we want to avoid inhaling whenever possible. Another interesting thing is that smaller particles will float around in the air for longer than larger particles due to the effects of gravity. So something the size of a tiny piece of carbon fiber will probably fall out of the air at about 10 centimeters per second. So it'll just drop right out of the air. You don't have to worry about it too much. But if you have strong fans blowing things around, like with your 3D printer, it could easily loft those up into the air and there would be an opportunity for you to potentially inhale those. Also, when it falls to the ground, it's not immediately harmless and inert. You can still touch it and then transfer it to your food when you go to eat something, or when you go to touch your face or wipe your mouth or pick your nose or whatever you decide to do with your hands. So just because they're falling out of the air rapidly doesn't mean they're completely safe, but it does mean that they're less likely to be inhaled, which is a good thing. Also, another interesting thing is the nanoparticles will deposit on walls relatively easily. So due to that Brownian motion, if they get near a wall, since they're bouncing around, they'll just like bump right into it, and then you don't have to worry about it being airborne anymore. That's why you'll notice if someone is smoking in a car, or if you drive a car for a long time, you'll get soot deposits all over on the interior of the car that you'll have to wipe up. That's just those smaller particles that just bump into the wall and get deposited there. You don't get large particles doing that because those are just falling straight out of the air and probably collecting on your dashboard and in your carpet. So I have an absolutely massive HEPA filter just because I know I work in an enclosed space and I'm concerned about these kind of particulate matters coming off of my 3D printer. So I bought the biggest, nicest HEPA filter I could find. Just taking a look at some of the footage that I have, even with the 3D printer running right next to my air quality monitor, it was dropping down to single digits of particulate count because I had that HEPA filter running it was at 3 out of 4, so it wasn't max power, but it was certainly a strong gust of wind. And the filters in that thing are massive. It's got 2 filters. They're about 1 foot wide by 3 feet tall, or about 1 meter by 1/4 of a meter wide. And there's 2 of them. And it just does a great job of cleaning out the air in my workspace. It's probably a little overkill even, but since I do a lot of filming and printing in there, I decided to get an overkill solution because I can set it to a lower setting that runs quieter but still provides a lot of filtration. I'll leave a link to the air filters that I used in this video, and it's kind of an expensive unit. I got that because I just needed something professional that works. If you're going to complain about how much a filter costs, might I remind you that you've probably spent more than I spent on my super nice luxury air filter on one of your 3D printers. So if you can afford a $1,400 3D printer or a couple $500 3D printers, it's really not that much of a stretch to just pay a little more and make sure you have a safe setup and you're working in a safe, clean environment. This is just a nice small little filter that you can run on your desk. And what I'm thinking is you could actually just buy the filter replacement, like this piece, and then do a little 3D printed adapter and install a little computer fan on here, and then set that on your desk. And you'd have a decently effective air filter setup. If you're on a budget, you can build something that's called a Corsi-Rosenthal box, which is basically a box fan that you strap a bunch of cheap filters from Home Depot together, and it does a great job of filtering air. There's a couple YouTube videos that I watched about it. I'll leave a link to one of them in the description below. But with that method, you can build an extremely effective air filter for about $30 or $40. So don't feel like you have to break the bank to get clean air in your workspace. Now you might be thinking, yeah, okay, so what? Plastic's everywhere, and particles are everywhere. I don't care. Everything that I touch on a daily basis is made out of plastic, even a lot of clothing and furniture. So why should I worry about my 3D printer printing with plastic? There's a major difference between using everyday household plastics and operating a 3D printer, and that is temperature. A lot of people don't think about how hot these printers actually are when they're operating. 220 to 260 Celsius is about the temperature that most 3D printing occurs. Americans don't really have a good sense of how hot that is, so let me put that in perspective. That's about how hot you would make the oven when you're about to put a pizza in it. All right, I think that's something that all Americans can understand intuitively. That's 400 Fahrenheit to 500 Fahrenheit in freedom units. So now tell me, if you're firing up the oven to cook a pizza, would you feel comfortable taking a spool of filament and chucking it in there and seeing what happens? Another way to think of it is, let's say you heated up your oven and you put your pizza in there, and then you're like, oh, I have this Tupperware container of macaroni. Let me put that in the oven too to heat it up. You would never do that just because plastics are generally considered to be not safe at those temperatures. And I feel like before people got involved in 3D printing, we all kind of had a general consensus that melting and burning plastic was bad. And that whole temperature range we've been discussing is just PLA and PETG printing temperatures. A lot of filaments go up to 300 C, which is around 600 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than your oven will go in most cases. Generally speaking, the hotter you make a piece of plastic, the more emissions it's going to produce. It's just like boiling water. The more you heat it up, the more it's going to evaporate. Now, these soots that are coming off of 3D printers are often released in such small quantities that you can't see them. Also, you're usually running a part cooling fan or other fans on the 3D printer, so that's blowing those little wisps of smoke away. So even if you could have seen them, they're being blown away before you can even recognize that it's an issue. So I think when it comes to 3D printers, we've kind of become complacent and have become okay with running them in areas where they're really not supposed to be. I really don't think you should be running a 3D printer in your bedroom. And if you are, at least open a window to let it air out a little bit. If you're living in an area where that's not possible, then at the bare minimum you should have some kind of filter running in the room to sort out those particles. Because if the filter doesn't pull them out of the air and you breathe them in, you're filtering them out of the air, and you don't want to do that. But Nathan, you might say, I only print with PLA and PETG. I have nothing to worry about. According to the tests, we've determined that even filaments that are generally considered to be safe, like PLA and PETG, could be emitting large amounts of particles. And the need for filtration and ventilation only goes up as you increase in print temperature and you increase the number of printers that you have in a space. So if you're running 5 printers in your bedroom, you want to crack your window wide open and get lots of air flowing in there. And having an air quality meter like this that allows you to actually check and verify that you're properly filtering the air out would definitely not be a bad idea. These are a bit expensive. I've bought a smaller, cheaper unit like this. This one only records the PM 2.5 reading, but that would still give you a general idea of how much contaminants there are in the room. I just like this one because it gives me a little bit more data, and I think that number of particles counter will be accounting for other particles other than these 2 specific size ranges. But yeah, even a basic air quality meter like this, you can probably get something like this for $10 or $20, will be able to give you some idea of, wow, I have grossly insufficient ventilation in here, and I definitely need to open a window or, stop running my printer. All right, so let's get into the last point that I want to make, and that is, what the heck is in our filaments? The truth is, most of us don't know what's in our filaments. A lot of the companies that sell their stuff have special additives or different blends or processing, and you don't know what's in them because they're keeping it as a proprietary secret formula that they need to keep secret because it's helping their bottom line. But really that ends up hurting the consumer because we're getting stuff that we don't know what it is. We don't know if we've had PLA that's been doped with nanotubes that could be harmful to you. We don't know if they're adding BPAs or phthalates or any number of harmful chemicals that could be aerosolized by your 3D printer and inhaled. There's just a complete lack of information. And fortunately, this is an area where the scientific research is starting to catch up. And there's actually a lot of good studies being performed about what these particles are, how much particles are generated in different 3D printing processes. Now, we've only been talking about FDM, but if you're running a resin-based printer, you're definitely going to want to have that well ventilated. Resin printing releases all sorts of stuff that is outside of the scope of this video, but maybe that's something that we can touch on in another video. All right, so here's a page. Polymax PLA claims to use nano reinforcement technology, which significantly increases its ductility. So what the heck is that? What does that mean? I did a cursory Google search and found that there's some research on how nano reinforcements in the form of carbon nanotubes can be added to polymers to increase their strength. Is that what they're using? Are they adding carbon nanotubes to this stuff? And there's also research that suggests that carbon nanotubes are harmful to people. To Polymaker's credit, they do have technical data sheets and safety sheets, but I'm not sure how thorough this information is. I think this is a developing field in terms of all these plastics, and we don't really know all the health effects of all the ingredients that might be added to these things. And that all stems from the fact that we don't know what's in the filament to begin with. So how can you say it's safe if you don't know what's in it? If we look on the Creality website, there's really no mention about what the heck is going on with these filaments. It's just a bunch of marketing drivel. There's no... Oh, here we go. Here's a manual. Is this what I think it is? Is this going to tell us what's in the plastic? No, of course not. It's a broken link. If I go to the Elegoo page, it's pretty similar to the Creality website. There's really not a whole lot of technical information here. They don't have any information about what type of additives are added to their filament. To Bambu Lab's credit, they do have some pretty good documentation here on like specific data sheets. They give you some chemical properties, but again, they're not really addressing all of the ingredients and telling you whether it has BPAs or phthalates added to the filament or any number of other things that might be harmful. When I went to the PLA CF page, it says it has carbon fiber, but as I discussed in the previous video, those fibers can come loose. So your customers need to be warned that, like, hey, there should be some safe handling instructions here on how to use this stuff properly. So I think that would be pretty easy to address. In the case of the carbon fiber stuff, just tell customers, hey, just wear gloves or clear coat parts that are going to be in human contact, and don't put food in the containers that you print out of this stuff. And I think this is an area where being more open source, or at least disclosing a list of the ingredients that you're using, or at least a list of the potentially harmful ingredients that are used in your filaments, would be beneficial to the consumers. You may have heard of BPA before. Not all polycarbonate plastics contain BPA, but nearly 3/4 of BPA used in the United States in 2003 went into the manufacture of polycarbonate. In rodent studies, they showed that prenatal and neonatal exposure to BPA was associated with early onset of sexual maturation, reproductive tract lesions, and altered developments of the mammary gland and other reproductive abnormalities. This is a relatively old paper, so there should be a lot more recent information on this stuff too. Just do your own research and learn about that, and then decide, do we want filament manufacturers to disclose what's in the plastics that are being aerosolized and inhaled and incorporated into our bodies as we hang out around 3D printers, or do we not want that? Another common additive to plastics are phthalates. Basically, from my understanding of this, is they get in between the polymers and prevent cross-linking. So cross-linking is what makes plastic strong, but if you have too much cross-linking, then it can become brittle and more prone to shattering. So a manufacturer might add phthalates to the plastic to prevent cross-linking so that it stays more flexible. It's commonly used in PVC, like flexible wiring. There's a difference between the PVC that's used to build water delivery systems and the PVC that's used to wrap wiring. Wire PVC is much more flexible, and that's because they're adding phthalates to it. Just going through the list of common phthalates, under assessment is endocrine disrupting, toxic to reproduction, endocrine disrupting, toxic to reproduction, endocrine disrupting, skin sensitizing. Phthalates are also commonly added to polyvinyl butyrol, which is PVB. I think that's the stuff that you can print it out and then you can do vapor smoothing with it. That's one of the filaments that you can do that with. So PVB, PVA, nylon, polystyrene, polyurethane, so TPUs potentially. How do they make TPU so squishy? Is it because they're adding phthalates to it? I don't know, because they don't tell us anything. So I just would like a lot more transparency from filament manufacturers so that we as consumers can make more informed decisions about what filaments we decide to use. What can we do about this? Are we just doomed to be inhaling unknown mystery plastics for the rest of time until we quit the 3D printing hobby? Well, I think manufacturers can take a more concerted effort to providing data. So if I know that a filament is just pure PLA or pure PETG with no additives, I would prefer that, because then at least I have a good understanding of what I'm getting from them. Most companies don't do any research into the safety and health effects of their 3D printers and their products. The only company that I've seen with some evidence that they've actually looked into this and have done some studies about it is Prusa. So Prusa has got a lot of their materials UL listed and has done skin testing to see, if they cause irritation. They've also certified the MK4 printer to produce acceptable levels of VOCs or low VOCs. I'm not sure what the certification is. Now, if you're printing ABS on your Prusa machine, then you'll still have to worry about VOCs. But these companies are making millions, if not billions of dollars selling 3D printers. You think the least they could do is do some research and figure out what the health and safety risks are and thoroughly communicate that to their consumers. And maybe they could even develop some special polymers specific to at-home 3D printing that are safer, that have lower emissions, But as it is right now, it seems like it's just a cash grab. Everybody's selling stuff. They're not really paying attention to the health and safety implications. I bet most of you don't even know that your 3D printer is emitting detectable amounts of smoke while it's running. And if you're running it in your bedroom with all your windows closed, then that's going to be harmful for your health potentially. This video is just me trying to explain what I've learned over the last couple of weeks of just reading into this stuff. This isn't health or occupational safety advice. If you need that kind of advice, I'd recommend talking to a professional. My goal here is to just kind of educate you guys a little bit on the basic concepts and also spread awareness that this is kind of an issue that I really hope 3D printer manufacturers take more seriously, and hopefully we'll have some improvements in the future because of it. If you know someone who's running a 3D printer in their bedroom, make sure to forward them this video and let them know, like, hey, maybe you might want to stop that or at least get an air filter or crack the window or something. It seems like common sense, but these printers are just shipped off to people and they have little to no idea of how to use them, and they might do some stupid stuff when they're starting out. So just help them out a little bit and help them run their 3D printers safely. Even Bambu Lab is telling you to run the printer in a well-ventilated environment. They also tell you not to run it barefoot, which I'm not sure if I'm going to do that one. But it's you should definitely be reading that stuff and taking their advice. And my advice, maybe. If you enjoyed this video, thanks for watching. I want to do a lot more experiments on this stuff, and this lab equipment ain't cheap, but it's the least I can do. You know, I do this YouTube stuff, and I get to focus on the ideas that I think are important. And I think health and safety when it comes to 3D printing is an overlooked issue, and I think it's important, and I just want everyone to know a little bit more about it. The stuff you think is safe now is the subject of documentaries in the future. Taking precautions may be cumbersome, but it is always worth it. That way you get a chuckle when the documentaries come out. Well, that's a bit of a morbid way to get the last laugh, but I get what he's saying there.